Let the games begin, and welcome to your July 28th daily briefing. We finally have the Senate Republican Relief Bill, the HEALS Act. It's proposed, it's out in the public, so now it's time to see how the plan holds up. Negotiations have just begun and things are already getting pretty heated. In this video, I'm going to break down where the opinion is currently at on this relief bill, what legislators are saying about it, and how it compares to the House's HEROES Act that was voted in a few months back. Now let's start with the stimulus check, the topic that everyone wants to hear about. The HEALS Act proposes a second round of stimulus checks, very similar both in size and scope to the first round under the CARES Act. It comes out to a $1,200 check to income earners under $75,000 a year for single filers and $150,000 a year for couples, with a $500 per dependent payment. Now this is really the only difference to the first round. Under the HEALS Act, adult dependents will be eligible for a $500 payment. Now this is huge. This is an area that I believe was much needed to add a little bit more assistance. There's just so many situations where those adult dependents were left out and it just didn't quite make sense in the first round. Despite this being more than the first round in that dependent department, this is still one of the major areas Democrats are fighting. Under the HEROES Act, the House voted in a stimulus payment that included $1,200 for individuals and an additional $1,200 for all dependents, including adult dependents. House Member Richard Neal had this to say about the proposal. He said, this is a direct quote from him, "Democrats were intentional when we added a full $1,200 payment for dependents in the HEROES Act. That's what the American people need right now." And I chose that quote because I felt that that really summarizes kind of how the Democratic side feels about this. Beyond this, the only other major issue with the stimulus check is under the HEROES Act, the House allowed people with individual taxpayer identification numbers to be eligible for a check, while the HEALS Act narrows that down to only Americans with work-eligible Social Security numbers. Now, ITIN numbers typically go to non-resident and resident aliens, their spouses, and their dependents. From here, there are a few other areas where Democrats feel the Republican plan kind of falls short. These areas include funding for state and local governments, eviction protections, SNAP benefits, and support for low-income communities. The state and local government funding aspect is one of the areas with the largest disparity between the Republican and the Democratic proposals. Under the HEROES Act, the House set aside nearly $1 trillion in funding, where in the HEALS Act, there's simply just a provision for more flexibility in previous funding for state and local governments, but no new funding allocated. So we might see a big fight there because $1 trillion difference is massive. I mean, that's the entire size of the HEALS Act, is what the HEROES Act wanted in funding just for state and local governments. Onto the eviction protections aspect. This is a major issue with the rent moratoriums that have come up federally. This means that landlords can now begin evicting their tenants again. Some have cited that this is going to cause an economic spiral. Once people become evicted, then they have to worry about their housing arrangements. They're going to spend much less money in the economy. Things are just going to get worse and worse. And then others think that protecting people from evictions are just going to cause more problems later. Either way, the HEALS Act does not contain eviction protections. However, state and local governments, city councils, and pretty much every other legislative body has the authority to enact a rent moratorium in their specific area. So this is largely a non-issue for most areas, as local moratoriums have been extended just about everywhere. Next we have SNAP, the Food Assistance Program. The HEROES Act provided more funding for this program, while the HEALS Act does not. The Democratic argument is that the HEALS Act contains a tax credit for business meals, but not funding for SNAP benefits. And I looked into this. This is actually true. I took a look at the HEALS Act, and it would allow taxpayers to deduct 100% of the costs from business meals through the end of the year. This is up from 50% where it sits at now. The idea is if businesses have more incentive to spend money at restaurants, this will ultimately help the food and service industries. President Trump is a big fan of this, and he tweeted that this will bring restaurants and everything related back and stronger than ever. So it's easy to see that this would ultimately help out restaurants in that industry. However, I have to admit it's also equally easy to point out the disparity of this with the tax credit on business meals versus more funding for SNAP benefits. Finally, the issue of support for low-income communities. Democrats say that the HEALS Act doesn't do enough in this area. This topic is a little bit buried because even in the HEROES Act, the plans are not these $100 billion plus proposals, but these are plans. Nevertheless, they're just smaller, more focused on local communities. Some of the support items for low-income communities in the HEROES Act include $4 billion in funding to expand high-speed internet to those who cannot currently afford it, $1.7 billion in funding for HBCUs and minority institutions, and $50 million in funding for environmental justice grants, just to name a few of the smaller items there. So they believe that there's not enough of those within the HEALS Act, and there needs to be more focus on the communities that are most in need and ultimately could potentially have been the most impacted from the pandemic. Finally, and possibly the most heated topic, is enhanced unemployment. Under the HEALS Act, unemployment would drop from $600 per week to $200 per week on top of normal state unemployment benefits. And this would only last, the $200 per week amount would only last until states can update their systems to then calculate employment based on a worker's previous wage. The enhanced unemployment would then be based on 70% of a worker's previous wage, and that is combined with the federal unemployment enhanced amount and each state's amount to total 70%. So this is another huge disparity from the HEROES Act, which outlined the continuation of $600 per week payments on top of normal state unemployment through the end of the year, with certain provisions to extend it through March of next year. So all of these issues brought up so far by the Democratic side have been issues largely of insufficient attention or funding for programs. So now let's get into some of the issues Democrats are saying received too much funding or attention under the HEALS Act. The largest one is $1.7 billion in funding for the construction of a new FBI building in Washington. Democrats have argued that the decision to include this in the stimulus bill was sparked by President Trump being worried that the current FBI building, which is old and needs a lot of renovations, could ultimately be turned into a hotel and provide competition to the Trump Hotel in downtown DC. Of course, we don't have any information on what their intentions are. This is just speculation on that side. The questions raised about this building's funding are fairly obvious, though, with things like, what does this have to do with the pandemic or the relief for the pandemic that is currently going on? And this is a fair question. However, unfortunately, the same questions could be asked for several items within the HEROES Act. So I see this one as even on both sides. Absolute nonsense, but even on both sides, unfortunately. I would personally just like to see, just once, a bill completely stick to the issue at hand instead of trying to place unrelated items for the sake of sneaking interest through. Now, this happens on both sides. This isn't like a one-party issue. We see it on both sides. With all this information coming to light, it's beginning to become obvious that negotiations just won't be quite as simple as we all hoped. Certain areas will, with very little doubt, be passed under whatever ends up getting voted in, whether that be some kind of alteration to the HEROES Act or some kind of alteration to the HEALS Act or some kind of new bill altogether. Things like the stimulus check are almost certain to be in there. Things like school funding, almost certain. Testing for viruses, almost certain to be in there. There seems to be just about no argument on those things, or additional funding for small businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program. Very little argument there, and we can, with a near certainty, say we're going to see those things in some kind of upcoming relief bill. However, many other areas, which we've explained throughout this entire video, are just not quite as certain, and that's really what's going to cause all the debate and the delays. And I just hope that not too many people struggle much more because of these delays. I mean, the questions that we still have are what will happen with state and local government funding? What will happen with enhanced unemployment? Will small issues like SNAP benefits be addressed? Will Republicans budge on their $1 trillion spending cap? These are all things that we look forward to see answers to as quickly as possible, as these issues have time limits. So this is all I have for today. I'd like to thank you for watching. Before you tune out, check out the link in my description for Webull. It's an easy-to-use investment brokerage. If you deposit $100 into your account, you'll receive 2 stocks completely free. And the best part is you don't even have to spend the $100 to keep the stocks. Plus, you'll be helping out this channel while you're at it, and I would appreciate it so very much. Anyways, I'd like to thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a profitable day.